and this is going to be very controversial to say, but marriage also is sex work because
I want to start off by commending Slumflower for a marketing genius. She's somehow able to attract a massive audience by regurgitating half-baked feminist theory and ideas about marriage, relationships, sex, etc., etc. So truly well done to her. Being able to grow a brand this well is fantastic. But getting into the comments and what she actually said about marriage being sex work, essentially, the summary of it is that marriage is sex work because women engage in marriage from a transactional point of view of they get married in the hopes that a man is gonna provide for them physically and emotionally, and then men get married because they want to have sex with consistently with a woman, and so that's the trade-off. Now, in the 1950s, that might make sense as analysis, but in the 21st century, in 2024, this analysis makes no sense. Now, in the days of yesteryear, when women had very little economic rights, this probably made a lot of sense. Maybe not even a lot of sense. I'm going to get into later, but in the 21st century, again, keeping this to the West, I imagine she's not claiming to speak for women in the global South or other countries like that. There's very little credibility to this argument. Women have almost just as much economic power as men do, and even if they don't really have to get married for economic protection because they can just go and get the same jobs that men do. So the idea that women are now marrying in the 21st century for economic protection doesn't really make much sense. I'd even say most men, at least a good proportion of men, marry for economic protection from the standpoint that we've really moved away from the male provider model of marriage, and so most marriages are fairly even down the middle. So a lot of men would wait, for example, for a woman so they can before they get a mortgage because it's cheaper that way, and a lot of us can't really afford it, especially if you live in London anyway. And so again, this argument that the reason why we do it in the 21st century, in the 1950s, you might have some credence to that argument, but in the 21st century, that argument is very outdated. And again, when I see people analyzing it, they've also been quoting scholars from the 1800s, which again, it makes sense to understand the historical context, but in the 21st century, again, that makes no sense. So already I would say our starting off point is a bit outdated and also kind of false. But also the second point of that is that even if you take this argument to be true, right, that back in the day, or maybe as recent as the 1980s, women were marrying purely because they didn't have economic rights or there wasn't economic parity between men and women, and so women had to get married to have some sense of economic guarantee. That would mean that in the 21st century, again, keeping this to the West, where these things don't really exist anymore, women will just simply stop getting married. Because if the whole point of marriage is that it's been transactional for the longest time and women gave sex and in return the men gave economic protection, now that women don't need economic protection anymore, then they wouldn't be getting married, right? But if you take, let's say, a poll of 100 women in the 1950s and 100 women in 2024, and you ask them, would you like to get married? In the 1950s, maybe 98% might say, again, just based on what we know about the times, might say they want to get married. If you did that poll in 2024, it probably will still be in the high 90s. And that tells you something about the reasons why women have always got married. Now, yes, in the 1950s, the economic protection argument loomed large and it was a significant, priority for women when they were getting married. But even then, poor people were getting married too. So that speaks to something about the real reasons or the underlying reasons why women still prefer to at least pair bond, maybe in the 21st century, given that marriages have kind of fallen out of favor and divorce rates and stuff. A lot of people might say they don't really ever want to get married, but do they really want to just go off in their life and have multiple partners or never actually commit to one person? Very, very few people, of men and women, actually choose to live that kind of lifestyle. So that tells you that deep down, there is an innate desire to have your emotional needs met. And if we're being honest, I don't know if it's biological or not, women have that more than men. So even if marriage, like we know now, marriage is not really a thing that's done for economic protection. A lot of women still choose to get married because they can't ignore that side of them. There is a part of them, a yearning, even as a man, I have it too, to want to pair bond with one person. And obviously the institution we understand that does that is marriage. A lot of people might choose not to get married, but they might have a civil partnership, or basically a marriage light. They might not have the rigid institution around, that makes it harder to separate in terms of divorce and stuff, but they'll still want to pair bond with one person and stay with that person for the rest of their lives. Now, if marriage only offered that transactional, relationship, as people like Slumflower claim, then you wouldn't really see women wanting to get married anymore. But we know that it's simply not true. I might know maybe personally one or two people that have said to me they don't ever want to maybe have kids or do something like that. But very, very few people say they don't want to get married, or they don't want to pair bond with one person for the rest of their lives. And so I think the third rail of this conversation is the fact that women have a stronger desire to have their emotional needs met than men do. And they seek that in monogamous relationships. So if you poll 100 men and 100 women, it's very likely that a lot more of the women will express a desire or very strong interest to wanting to be married than the men do. And so unfortunately, this probably leaves them vulnerable to, I guess, being exploited in that relationship, because they want it more than men do, unfortunately. And so you have, the argument about the fact that women contribute, financially as much as they've ever have, but also still have the emotional and physical labor of child rearing and helping around the house, while traditionally in even relationships nowadays, men probably don't carry their weight as much as they should in that aspect. Makes sense. But this doesn't really have much to do with sex. The trade-off there is not that, women are doing more and they're giving sex because they want protection. That's just a completely separate thing. But I guess, again, if you're someone like Slumflower and this is your brand, you do have to make these tenuous arguments even when they don't exist or really make no sense or have basis in reality. So, again, I applaud her for trying to do it as part of her brand, but it doesn't really make much sense. I also think it's interesting that she mentions all the things that women expect a man to provide in a relationship. Again, like I mentioned before, her relationship model is totally flawed and outdated. But she mentions, like, women expect the man to provide, to protect them, to etc. etc. And then she says, and as a woman, you give sex in return for all of those things, which is interesting because she's seeming to kind of almost belittle, the emotional needs of men, and also what men actually, frankly, enjoy from an emotional point of view by being in a stable monogamous relationship. And she's just flattening that to all men want is sex. Again, terrible, terrible analysis, but it makes perfect sense when you consider the type of audience and the demographics she's trying to appeal to. I think it's actually quite a harmful kind of argument to make that, men don't enjoy a level of emotional protection in relationships themselves. A lot of men might not admit this, but I think many of them would actually, because it's a fact. But the fact that she doesn't even see this and just goes straight to the fact that all these men want is sex, as though we're just kind of, sex animals and sex objects, and all we can enjoy in relationships with women is just sex. Totally juvenile. Teenagers can come up with better analysis than this. But I think generally what you see in arguments like these and other, people like her, is that women are the complicated, hard to understand, very complex and interesting people, and men are just, simple, I guess, simpletons. They just want sex. That's what they want. That's who they are. You can boil down all their emotional needs and desires in a relationship to just sex. And so that's why you can have analysis like men provide all these things, or you want men to provide all these things, and what you're going to give them in return is sex. Okay. What? And of course, it goes without saying that the idea or concept that sex is something that women give to men should always be rejected, and it's actually sexist on the face of it, because it promotes the idea that women's bodies, and by extension sex, is a commodity that, again, all these sex crazed men just really, really desire. And the way women can, extract a fair exchange is by giving up their bodies in exchange for, all the things she mentioned. That's actually quite sexist, because again, it obviously ignores the fact that women, like I said, are contributing financially to, romantic relationships more than ever. But also you have to understand that people like this, they want that kind of exchange. The idea that sex should be something that's commoditized is something they relish and they celebrate, because their perspective is, well, we've been, our bodies have been, I guess, used and abused for all these centuries. So when we put a price on it, we're basically extracting equal value back, and we're trying to restore some type of parity. But while that sounds good all it does is promote the idea that, again, their bodies are something that is, can be exchanged in that kind of way. Whereas what you should be trying to promote is that, no, this is a mutual thing that I should be enjoying just as much as you. But she can't really make that argument because this is not really what, it's not red meat to the base, basically. So to conclude, I guess I'd say, as a personal general principle or rule, any arguments that try to simplify or oversimplify humans should always be rejected. Humans are infinitely complex. Human relationships are even more complex because they involve basically more than one human. And so the critique of marriage as, I guess, an unfair institution in which value is not exchanged for men and women is an argument that definitely can be made. But if the reduction is that, or the explanation for the imbalance in that relationship is that it's imbalanced because men provide and protect and do all these physical things and women provide their bodies, that argument is not only outdated, even in the 1950s, I don't even know how true it was. And so that is definitely a very, very weak and lame argument, which ultimately makes no sense. But you can understand, given her brand and, again, the fact that she's a marketing genius, we're still talking about this now, you can understand why she would make such a simplistic argument. Even when people made the argument in the past, I'm sure it had its place within other arguments, and there were definitely counters to that. So the fact that some very smart people have made those arguments, I saw some people putting out quotes about, Engels and Angela Davis, doesn't mean they're infallible. And again, this sits in the context of the time they were living in. If they tried to make that argument now, I think most people would rightly look at the evidence around them and say, this makes no sense. So basically, looking at the evidence around us, this makes no sense. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed that. Hope you found that informative and interesting. Thank you for watching, and I'll speak to you on the next update.